welcome to today's podcast, Feeling Seen. I'd like to invite my guest, Kevin Breemes. Is that correct, Kevin, how I pronounce it?
Breemes,
Breemes?
this is technical
Breemes?
skills, but totally.
Okay, Kevin Breemes,
Yes.
um, who reached out to me when I put out for a guest, or a request for a podcast guest. So thank you for that. But what made you want to come on the podcast? What interests you about it?
No, of course. And first of all, I just want to say thanks for having me. Talking about neurodivergency, talking about ADHD, those types of things. It's frankly something that I've discovered relatively late in my life. It's something that even since being diagnosed, like I said, later in life, in my late 30s, early 40s, it's something I've never really talked about except to make a few close friends. And so, you just more and more as I go through life, as I, navigate different transitions and with things that are going on with life as life goes on or whatever, it's just maturity, I guess, is one thing. But hearing you talk about, your journey, your story, it's inspiring for one thing. And also, I think that it's important to give a voice to a name such as ADHD or neurodivergency, and just it helps to remove the stigma that I think has kind of been out there for many years, and just realize that hey, it has a name, it has more than a name, it's got a face to it, it has a voice, and I think it's important to share those stories and messages.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that. And I had a similar experience, late diagnosis. And I don't know if I was terribly comfortable saying to people that I had diagnosis. And as you can see, I'm not really a professional at this, but I do think people need to speak up and share their voice. So I really appreciate you for joining me on this. So you had a late diagnosis. Can you tell me how that came about? Was it somebody said something, or how did you find out?
Yeah, it's interesting because the truth be told, it was more like a mirror in the sense that so I have a family, have a wife, my kids are growing up, going through their own natural growing stages and all that, and one of my daughters, actually, she was having challenges with focus, with anxiety, you know almost like a time warp at times. She'd go to work on something and just get bogged down, or she'd get distracted. A lot of those things that are sometimes typical traits, almost stereotypical of those with ADHD, and sometimes not. So the truth is we wanted to help her kind of cope with life as she's growing up, going, the early teenage years and all those types of things. And so we went to a therapist, a healthcare provider, and as she's a minor, of course, I'm sitting in those sessions, and so I'm doing a lot of listening. I'm also doing a lot of absorbing, and it was just kind of interesting in that through the first one, the second session, the third session, I'm taking this all in, and it almost felt like the therapist was describing my life or talking to her about my life. And so, obviously I didn't want to take anything away from her. We were there for her, but at the same time, just started bringing a lot of thoughts into my head as I started kind of reflecting on how I was growing up. And so, after I just remember after having one of those sessions with the therapist and with her, I kind of pulled him off to the side and I said, "This is kind of what I'm feeling. You really kind of connected on something with me, and do you feel like this is something I should potentially look into or explore?" And it as there's no harm in checking into it and talking with someone and learning more about yourself, learning about what you're dealing with. And so I went through, had a couple of sessions with him, and had that discussion, did some of the diagnostic tests and things like that. And really, what we discovered was, um, I had those. Basically, put it this way, he said you have symptoms of someone with ADHD, and so I think what that meant was, I was kind of on that cusp of yes, do you, no, you don't, or sometimes you do in certain situations, and sometimes you don't in other situations, that type of thing. But the reality is just through those conversations I had with him, just to give you a little bit of a background about me and what that was like growing up. I was one of those, I was one of those kind of nerdy kids in school. The therapist even said something to me that really connected with me. He said, oftentimes high performing individuals will mask the symptoms of ADHD. So I dug into that a little bit more, trying to understand. I was a straight A student. I was an athlete, I was a, you know, all around, I just decent kid. We'll just put it that way growing up. So I didn't cause any trouble or anything like that. But then also got to looking at some of those things those symptoms I had and those things that I portrayed. So I was a constant procrastinator. I was a perfectionist in the sense that I would, just mull over things until I thought they were perfect. I would, stay up late the night before an assignment was due in middle school, high school, whatever it may be, and just trying to get it completely perfect. And the truth is these are just symptoms that are oftentimes seen in someone with ADHD. I wasn't and we talk about the stigma, we talk about the traits or whatever. So, growing up in the 80s, and even in the early 90s, the kids with ADHD were those that were bouncing off the walls. They wouldn't sit at their desk. They were, all over the place, right? And, constantly distracted. And whereas I had some of those traits, I wasn't that kid that was always disruptive and getting up, but at the same time, I do it right now. I talk too much sometimes. But a lot of that just comes from, feeling uncertain about myself. Sometimes it's a, self-confidence thing. Sometimes it's I'm uncomfortable with silence, all those types of things. I used to get C's in conduct, right, in grade school because I was that kid that was distracting or disrupting in that way, even though I wasn't jumping up from my desk. So long story short is just all these things really started coming to mind as I went through these therapy sessions with my daughter, and I went through the diagnostic process, and learned something about myself that's kind of set me on this journey.
Yeah. And listening to you, so many of those things sound familiar to me too. Although, to be fair, I was the kid bouncing off the walls and being distracted. But in many cases, it was boredom because I think it's like a superpower, right? Your neurodiverse skill is like a superpower. For me, it was hyper focused, not regulated focus, and it was just like bored, if you like. So now that you have this diagnosis, how has it changed you? Have you rethought things that you've done in the past? Has it changed how you parenting? Does it change how you do things today?
The answer is yes, across the board. Um, Truth be told, it's just more about self-reflection, I think, and just kind of understanding more about who you are as an individual, how you function, how you do things, what makes you tick. Um, Regarding my parenting methods, I just have more empathy for my daughter. I try to lead by example. She's going through those formidable teenage years. There's a lot of learning and growing up, obviously, that comes with that, just in general. So that's one thing. But then even on top of that is just helping her to understand more about who she is by having my ability to connect and relate, helping her understand things along the lines of, time management, managing expectations, just how you show up every day. But at the same time, I think what's really important is you don't have to be perfect. You don't have to be the person that you see online and social media. You don't have you are your own self as an individual. You can be imperfect on any given day. And that it's also just about, I think, constant improvement in ourselves, right? Realizing who we are, what can I do a little bit better? Okay, I had a bad day today. That's okay. Let's pick up tomorrow and keep moving, right? So, in terms of my parenting style, it has a lot to do with that. I think it's been a gift in so many ways, and that
Mhm.
I can have that relation with her and we can have those conversations. I make mistakes constantly. We all do as parents and just as individuals. And so, even when that happens, I do my best to try to just apologize for that if I do something that maybe I could do better. Because kids obviously look up to their parents and they emulate what they see. So that's one thing there. But then also just for myself, I I I used to be, and I still am to some degree, that person that has post-it notes all over their desk, right? And really all that means is, what are my to-do lists, right? What are the things I need to get done? And oftentimes I've found as I've been going through this journey is, okay, got to do this, got to do this, got to do this. And before I know it, I have 15 post-it notes. Go, which one's the most important? Which one has to get done first? What's the most, critical thing? And to the comment that you made earlier about, the hyper focused and getting into that kind of flow mode about, I was listening to a podcast not too long ago, and it talked about how ADHD, let me make sure I get this right. The brains are attention focused, or interest focused. They are not basically importance focused. And so, right, when we think about what that means, things that interest me, I'm all in. I'm digging in, I'm jumping in. Give me all the details. Why does it work? How does it work? All that type of thing. And then there's some mundane task over here where I frankly can just break down, right? Where do I start? How do I do it? And I'm almost kind of thinking about the things that I want to do versus the things I should do. And so again, those to-do lists, managing those expectations, making sure that I prioritize and frankly sticking to it, I think is
Mhm.
critically important. Holding myself accountable in that way, I think is critically important. And that's really one thing that I've kind of learned. And that I try to, again, emulate and share and show to my daughter and those around me.
Yeah, no, again, so much of that resonates with me. And the same thing. I if I love something, I can just lock myself in, work on it. Before I know it's nighttime and I'm
Sure.
still there. You give me something like a finance spreadsheet, I'll just stare at it for like 5 hours, go and get a bunch of snacks, walk around, make a million coffees, anything to stop that 10 minutes. And that's one of the reasons I use AI is kind of have, because a work at home situation, I've got somebody who I give all my priorities to, not sticky notes, in the morning. And then I'll keep checking in to make sure I get there. Or otherwise, I just push things to a side and all sorts of things. So, yeah.
I ask you a question, and how do you hold yourself accountable to that? Because it's so easy just to keep moving on past those more interesting things, right? So I'd love to understand maybe what you do in that case. I mean, how do you hold yourself accountable to that?
Um, well,
Or does AI do that for you?
so AI helps. can it can't make me do anything I shouldn't do, but it does help, especially if I have stuff that has certain timelines, and also it I'll give it my list of to dos, and it'll keep checking in, and then if it gets closer to the timeline, it starts reminding me that you're running out of time. You've got a point here to do. It's not perfect. It is a machine. I don't like it. I can just shut the machine down. Um, but I guess it because like in ADHD, there's a talk about body doubling and having somebody working with you in the same room, maybe not working on the same thing, but you kind of replicate what they're doing. The AI is like having a person here that I can look up, ask a question, get myself back on track because it's really easy to push that stuff you don't want to do down and out for sure. Um, so what other questions? I had a ton of questions, but there's so many interesting things here. So one of my issues when I was diagnosed was telling people. Um, it was although I mean I really told my family and stuff who apparently already knew. Everybody seemed to know,
They're
right?
surprised, right?
They were not. And actually, my husband said, "How is this a surprise to you?" Right? Which it is. Was to me it was kind of weird, right? 1 in 5 people in the world have some kind of neurodiversity, and more and more older people are being diagnosed, and that's basically because it didn't really exist when we were kids. You were either super quiet, nerdy, avoiding the emotional side, or bouncing off the wall. When you had that diagnosis, how how did you feel about telling people? I mean, not that we all had to go and run around and tell our medical history to everybody, but how comfortable were you sharing?
Well, so and it wasn't so important to me to put a name to it, right? Or to it was just it was almost like I guess I would say when I, speaking to a therapist about it, it was an opportunity for me to just kind of unload, right? Put things out there, try to just learn and understand a little bit more about myself. I didn't think that there were, I wasn't you know, I'll just say heavily depressed. It wasn't that type of scenario, like, life, what is my life's meaning type of thing. It wasn't that, but it was just interesting for me as someone who is neurodivergent, who's ADHD, who's interested in things. It was good to get that feedback. It was good to get that acknowledgement. And so, it wasn't that I wanted to run out of that office and say, I've got a name. I know who I am. That's not what it was about. But what it did is it just helped me to understand a bit more about who I was, kind of how I operated, and then I could start learning about how to function a little bit more, and be a bit more productive, right? But in terms of telling others, I again, I'm like you. I don't think it was a surprise per se to anyone in my family. I'll one really quick story. I mean, I grew up as a percussionist, as a drummer, and I'm always tapping on things or whatever. And my wife will tell, she'll remind me, hey, you're tapping or you're fidgety type of thing. And, I have an interest in music. I love music. It's a connection for me. But at the same time, realizing, well, why did I choose percussion? Well, one, my mom was a drummer, so that's maybe a fun fact. But the other part is, it just seemed to make sense, and it was, it's just about rhythms and things like that. And so the long and short of this whole thing was, I've always been a little bit fidgety. I've always been that type of, person. And again, in more self reflection over time, well, maybe it makes sense that I was a drummer. It makes sense now why I tap. I don't tap because I'm a drummer. I tap because maybe I have this, ADHD thing going on. But back to your question, as I got off on this tangent, about telling others, it's been great, a great experience. And what I mean by that is, it's not something, again, I go and I shout from the rooftops. I share it with people that are close to me. Of course, family knows, but on top of that, close coworkers or people that I trust, um, you know, coworkers who are friends, right? That type of thing. And oftentimes it's just met with, that makes sense, or I understand, or that's interesting, or I see that in myself, or that type of thing. So no, and at no point have I, from those people that I've shared with, those trusted individuals I've shared with, have I felt any type of stigma or negativity. I think that they appreciated it, just as a way of learning a bit more about me. It also maybe helped them to be able to connect a little bit better with me and understand, again, if I get in, like I'm doing right now, get off on these side tangents and long conversations of details. A lot of times it's driven by that, but at the same time, just it helps them to understand a bit more about me. So I'll dig one step deeper. So we talk about, close friends or coworkers who know, but then also about sharing with leadership within a company. That's a challenging thing, right? Because it's like, who do you trust? Who do you want to tell? Who do you want to share that with? I've had a couple managers in my career who I've shared that with and have been overly accepting. I oftentimes get a, how can I help? How can how can we, they'll work with me on things like prioritization. They'll work with me on things like time management. They want me to dig in on the things that I love to do because they know that's where I'm best. The opposite side of that, I've had leaders who have not been accepting of that, and they've almost, in so many ways, whether they didn't necessarily say it directly, but it's almost like, wow, something just switched, and then going forward, you almost felt diminished or put in a corner. So, like I say, it's important, I think, to share with those who you trust, who are accepting of you as an individual, who are open to that, and then also being reflective on who you share it with, because the last thing I want to do is for it to be a crutch. That's not my intention. I just want it to be so that others know a bit more about who I am, how I operate, and why sometimes I might be a little quirky, might be a little talkative, and really what brought me to where I am.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. On my side, I shared it with my family. It was actually a coworker who said to me that my ADHD was showing through, and I was like, "Wait, I'm not ADHD." And they're like, "When you know, you know." And I didn't mean to really tell anybody, but I guess I was in a trigger mode, and I just announced it in all hands and told everybody.
Okay.
Uh,
Just
have
rip the
the
Band-Aid off, Anna.
I was like, but it was actually really interesting because it opened up a whole conversation and people were like, I am too, and I'm this and that. I did not really know how to deal with it. And I was told to take some time and go be creative, which would have felt like I was just being sidelined. But actually, the interesting thing, and I wanted to share with you and people out there are studies out in the market, and I'll find a link and put it in to the chat that actually says neurodiverse people are 30% more productive. I'm pretty sure it's Microsoft has a neurodiversity HR hiring program. So they're actively looking for people who are creative, who are thinking outside of the box, who, maybe aren't the most socially aware. That's one of my problems, uh, but are super smart. So even though I didn't mean to tell people, I'm kind of really glad I did. And then, I don't know, I mean, about you. You mentioned that you've told close friends and coworkers. Are you finding a large percentage of your close friends and coworkers that you connect with are also neurodiverse? Because most of mine seem to be.
So that's funny. Truth is, to some degree, right? And so as with most things, there's different levels and degrees, right, of this or that. There's some people who are just easily distracted by nature. There's some people that, you know, okay, are, we'll just say, full blown ADHD. There's some, more extreme, some less. And like I mentioned, my quote diagnosis was, symptoms, similar to or having of ADHD. In other words, I wasn't off the scale in that direction, but I sure was heading in that direction. I was on that teeter-totter type of thing. So, some days will be better than others, I guess is what that's getting to. But um the truth is that I think our society has changed. I think with the introduction and prevalence of social media, everything's changing constantly, right? I mean, everything is nothing. If without aging and dating ourselves, we think back to we'll just call simpler times, right? Where what you had to deal with was pretty much what was in front of you. And today it's what's on, your streaming service, what's on the TV, what's on your phone and devices, what's on social, everything is constantly coming at us a million miles an hour. And so whether that's true neurodivergence or whether that's just distraction or just being overwhelmed by what's going on around us, that kind of is who knows, I guess is what I'm getting at. But at the same time, I mean, you and I, we work in the marketing world and the marketing side of things. And I think that the traits of us as individuals are maybe a bit more conducive towards that type of career.
I
And
imagine so.
no, I completely think it is. And then the other part is, I heard that term you're mentioning about, go and be creative, but also what I know about you and what you do in SEM and SEO is so analytically minded as well. So I think oftentimes, and this is how I kind of, explain who I am, and I think I know this about you as well, is we oftentimes are creative and analytical. And I think that's a strength oftentimes that most people, I say in air quotes, most people are tend to be more creative or tend to be more analytical. And, and we'll just call it a trend of two between, you and me.
Mhm.
I think people in our fields and doing the things that we do, I think tend to have a bit of both. So I guess the long story short is the people that we surround ourselves with and oftentimes are associated with, in whether, I'll just say in our careers and our work, for them to go, oh yeah, I'm kind of like that too. Well, it sort of makes sense because of the nature of the individuals that are working within that group.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I definitely, as we went through the conversation, saw so many similarities. Your percussion and drum playing. So I actually played piano, which doesn't have a pattern, not really, but I was actually deaf at the time, so I had to learn by patterns and metronomes and stuff. And I definitely, my job in SEO and all sorts of, it's all about patterns and looking at data and trends. So for sure, so much of that resonates. So I think I just have a couple more questions, but I honestly could talk to you for hours on this.
This is fun.
It's so nice to have,
Helpful. So
yeah, so nice to have somebody who has similar trends and gone through it and learned the same way. So as you know, I wrote a book around how I use AI and stuff. And one of the questions I get a lot, am I using AI to fix myself? Um, I never really thought about that because I don't feel I'm broken. Um, but have you ever come across any kind of negative statements like that? I have a real issue with causing disability, saying I have a disability, I'm neurodiverse. I don't think it is. It's a special power, but I just wanted to know how you felt around that and what is your special power?
So I'll mention AI first, in terms of how I like to use it. So just since you brought that up, and so to me, AI is it's a search engine on steroids, for lack of a better way, right? So, as we talk about getting into the things that I love to do and I want to learn about and go down that rabbit hole, right? Those things that could take hours, and frankly did take hours, especially as we're growing up, and heaven forbid we walk into a library and had to look at books and do research that way. That was the old school way, right? Encyclopedias and whatnot. But I like using AI and generative AI for the research side of things. I love
Mhm.
that it can give me the most poignant things. What are the things I need to know? It can bring information back to me very quickly. Secondarily, if we kind of shift that and go to the things that maybe I don't love to do quite as much, AI can help me in my productivity in a way that I can get things done faster, and then I can get back to the things I love to do. Or
Right.
so, that's kind of that type of thing, and how maybe I would use AI. I don't know. What was the other part of your question after that? I guess.
Uh,
See,
be-
I've already,
Been there, done that. Um, so some people would suggest if you're neurodiverse that you're broken. I don't agree with that. In fact, I think being neurodiverse is a superpower. For me, my um, inability to regulate my focus and switch between a million things is actually, I word that as able to multitask, right? I mean, or something. So, what would you say your superpower is?
yeah, and I as I mentioned, I think I mentioned this to you earlier offline, but one of the things that I do as I'm going through tasks or going through, could be a job interview, or I could be going through something like this. I have lots of notes. I collect a lot of information. So forgive me if I look down a little bit, but I wanted to kind of reflect on this because I think it is kind of important. So in terms of superpowers, right? So for me, it's the typical hyper focused. When I'm zoned in, I'm on, and I'm, productive, and I'm spitting out things, and things are happening, right? I work extremely well, in my opinion, under pressure,
Hmm.
which is also kind of a trait, right? When the dopamine and the norepinephrine starts kicking in, that's when we learn how to hyper focus. And I've even done some research on this, and it says that, because you wonder why do we get hyper focused on the things that we're interested in, and what that norepinephrine does, and I'm no health expert, but I'm just trying to remember the high points. It causes us to focus. It actually increases and speeds up cognitive function, which I found was really interesting. And so I think, and that also explains a bit about why we tend to procrastinate as well, because it's the closer you get to a deadline, the more you procrastinated, you're now just creating pressure, naturally, right? So I
Hmm.
with that, my superpower would be the ability to hyper focus, the ability to work extremely well under pressure. I have a very strong analytical depth in terms of understanding why and how things work. I love to dig in, almost an engineering mindset. I love to tinker and break things in order to fix them, because that makes me, I think that makes me better going forward. I tend to do very well with strategy. I think I do a pretty good job of being able to see around corners. That's one thing I will say, is as I talk to people, and I think that some people are accepting of this and other people are maybe not as accepting of it, is that I oftentimes look for problems before they even arrive. And so why would you do that? Why would you not just react to what happens in the moment? Because I think if I'm preparing myself for other situations and alternatives and whatnot, I feel like I'm ahead of the game, right? So that's another thing in terms of strategy, is being able to look ahead and go, okay, well, if this happens, I could do this, or if this happens, I could do this. And even if one of those two things doesn't actually happen, I feel like I've prepared myself to be able to react on the fly. So that's another thing. And then just frankly, just being able to drill deep. And as I kind of mentioned, just digging in, being an expert in a lot of areas, or I like to become an expert, or I try to aspire to be an expert. I'm never going to be an expert, but just trying to do better. But and then the other side, I'll just talk about the negatives, right? You have a superpower here, you can't be perfect in everything, so there's going to be negatives also. I'm a a procrastinator at heart. It just is who I am. Sometimes I can become overwhelmed from task switching. So I'm working on something here, but I've got to get pulled over there. And sometimes then I just don't know how to reorient and get started over here because I want to
Mhm.
be doing this. And then another one is perfectionism. Um, I've had to really reorient my mind and myself that says sometimes you have to err on the side of progress over perfection, because you can spend all your time, go down this rabbit hole, and the truth be told, in the marketing world, or I've done a lot of work in the retail and consumer space, it never fails. As soon as you do something, what I always tell people is, if the reason I'm also oftentimes drawn towards the retail and consumer side in terms of my work and my marketing and things like that, is if you love something, um, it's great. But if you don't like something, it's okay. Give it a week, it's going to change. And so
Mhm.
that's the other part, is I like that fast natured side. That's why I do the work that I do with tech products and retail and consumer, because it's always moving, always changing. And that's the other thing I've done, is I've kind of reflected over my career, is why I've always been pulled in this direction, and it all just perfectly aligns with who I am. So I I,
Yeah.
I covered about 5 different things there, probably things you didn't even ask, but again,
No.
I'm just kind of going off the top of the head.
No, that was really good. And definitely, I see again myself in that. I do try to be more conscious now that I know, but even this week I got hyper focused in and pulled a 36-hour day because I was just so focused on it. So I really appreciate you joining the podcast today. I have one final question for you. Looking back through your life, is there any aha moments, anything that you did like super crazy, weird, funny that you can go, oh, okay, that was my ADHD kicking in? Or would you change it if you knew?
I'll just put it this way: nothing over the top where I could, put my finger on and go, "That's exactly why." Again, I kind of, touched on, why I chose the career that I chose. Why, I'm a percussionist and a drummer growing up, and even over the past few years, it just makes sense. It's what I like to do. It's changing. It's constant motion. One thing that I do reflect on is, if I could look back just at myself as a kid, or if I had known earlier, kind of who I was or how I did things or whatever. And, one thing I would like to see, and I think it's happening. I'd like to look at it in this way. We grew up at a time, um, before and after the internet. We grew up at a time before and after social media, before and after AI. We grew up at a time when there was more of a stigma around kids with ADHD. Again, the troublemakers, they're constantly bouncing off the walls, that type of thing. And I believe that we're living in a time now where, and a lot of this is the benefit of AI and data and all that. We're living in a time now where we're just learning so much more about the human body, about the brain and all that. And so if I guess to sort of touch on your question, but if I look back, and a lot of who I was as a kid growing up makes so much more sense. I'm a lot more, I'll just say, comfortable. Not that anybody cares or knows or remembers, but I do, right? As an individual. Um, it's just one of those things that I realize now that I'm not different per se, but my brain is wired a little bit differently. I'm not broken. I think you used that term earlier.
Mhm.
We just tend to do things differently, and I'm really excited about this time that we're living in now, where you know people are more open to learning about individuals. They're more open to people as individuals, who they are, how they operate. You know, all that. And so I think that neurodiversity and ADHD and everything that comes with it is just another, piece of that. And so I think it's important that we look back, we reflect on ourselves,
Mhm.
be accepting of ourselves, we give ourselves grace, frankly, and just know that I'm not different, I'm not broken. My brain just works a little differently. And then what can I do every day to be a little bit better? And and then on top of that is how can I be more open to others who may be in the same boat as I am? Um, and I don't mean that in the negative way, but just helping them to grow and helping them to improve themselves. And I do that by sharing. And this is probably the biggest way I've done that, other than telling the individuals that I've spoken to. So doing this on a podcast, it's a way just to share my experience. Hopefully, people will see it, can relate to it, learn from it, and then be inspired to go and help others that also may be in the same situation.
Thank you, Kevin. That was absolutely amazing. And that's what this whole podcast experience is, trying to get people to be more open. People have an honest conversation. It's okay to be who you are. We're all different. We're all wired different. We're all got superpowers and stuff like that. So I really appreciate you coming on to the podcast. For those watching, if you'd love to come on, please reach out to me. I'm always looking for people to share their stories. We should be proud of who we are. We're amazing people. Let's share it with everybody. Thank you, Kevin.
Thanks, Don. I appreciate the opportunity.